Okay, greetings. Thank you very much for coming. So this is a course that Raphael and I have given now for the last 4 or 5 years. It was for the first, up until now, it's been an informal part of the course here. So it's been available to law students and students from anywhere else in the university. And our objective was always that it would become part of the law degree, and that was approved by the faculty last winter. So that's where we are. Some of you, if you've seen the introduction to the to this course, you may have seen these pictures of Karvan. This is him in Islamabad, in Pakistan, in 2019. And you may also have seen Happy, and she was in the Bronx Zoo in 2020. And the reason we wanted to put these pictures in to start with was to give you a real context, because cases were brought in relation to both of these animals, with different outcomes, but they were brought in the case of both of them. And both of them were concerned with the idea of what is fair for these animals. Is it right what we're doing? Should they not have some legal status that could be recognised by the courts so that their circumstances can be improved? In both cases, these were animals that did have companions and now are on their own in their respective zoos. So this first lecture, really we're just going to talk about the idea of where all this has come from. Trying to give you a foundation to the notion of why do we think about animals the way we do. And I think like any social situation, it's entirely defined by us. How we view anything, how we view property, how we view people, how we view the planet or the ocean is a social rule. So we're largely defining them. And the way we've defined animals has been largely established for a long time. I just picked one here from the Christian Bible: be fruitful and increase in number, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. I'm not suggesting we're following this sort of biblical instruction, but what we're certainly doing, and what we've certainly done since then, is regard animals as our property, to rule over them, to catch them, to kill them, to eat them, at times to worship them, to praise them, to love them, but also these things. Thomas Aquinas, similarly, the same sort of idea, the idea of control. It is in keeping with the order of nature that man should be master over animals. And that's, I think, again, now all animals are naturally subject to man. So again, very much this idea that animals are our property. It's a paradigm, okay? It's simply a way of viewing things. And we've had, the law in our society is entirely caught up with paradigms. The ideas of how we see things, what relationship we have with the things around us, whether it's people, whether it's related to gender, whether it's related, as I say, to environment or planet. They are simply paradigms of what we think we're entitled to do and what the right thing is to do. You may have come across this, Jeremy Bentham, who started questioning, in a way, questioning how we should be treating animals. Now, Jeremy Bentham wasn't arguing for I think, stopping killing them. He was talking about how the law should respond to animals. He was writing there in the second part of the 18th century, early 19th century. And the idea of saying, well, we should be thinking about animals differently because they can suffer. And the idea of animal suffering is something which perhaps at a physical level we've been aware of, but it hasn't, that hasn't translated, if you like, into, in many cases, into our actions, and it certainly hasn't always translated into the law. Karvan again, now in an elephant sanctuary in Cambodia, because in this case, the law, the courts in Pakistan basically said, Carvan is an intelligent, sentient animal that has feelings and emotions, and we are disrespecting him by keeping him on his own. So, there are no animal rights laws. Perhaps it's an intrinsic element of the way the law has viewed animals and society has viewed animals. There are, in many countries, animal welfare laws or anti-cruelty laws. And we're going to be looking next week at the sort of historical sources of these things, going back 200 years. In fact, we're 1 year away from the 200th anniversary of a UK Act called Martin's Act, passed in 1822, which was one of the first acts anywhere in the world to regulate cruelty in relation to animals and regulate how people can treat animals. But animal welfare is about recognizing that animals feel pain, and that being cruel to animals is not something which we should be doing, not something which we should be condoning, that it's something that should be prohibited. Now, anti-cruelty, I say animal welfare, anti-cruelty, if you like, is part of it. This is to do, as we'll see next time, with beating and striking and so on. Animal welfare takes a broader view and is interested in ideas of how we care for animals, what sort of living conditions they have, what sort of life they have. And in all these cases, the animal welfare, anti-cruelty, they regulate how animals can be treated. And of course, they're doing so, though, within the existing paradigm of ownership and control. So they're doing so, if you like, challenging, or if not challenging, certainly restricting the right of the owner to do with his or her own property the way they wish to. Animal rights, if it came about, or when it will come about, would be a fundamental change. It would be as enormous a change as one could imagine, because there's so many parts of human life and activity which involves animals, and usually involves those animals being slaughtered and eaten. Animal rights, we'll look at this in a minute, but animal rights in principle would start to challenge some of those ideas, would start to challenge the way, the very basic, fundamental way that we can approach animals, that we can deal with them, and how they should be treated. So it is paradigmatic and would have enormous implications. Before we get there, though, you have to start by saying, well, why is this a story? Why is there a basis even for contemplating animal rights? What is it about animals that makes them more like, say, humans than like other forms of property, a table? What's different? Why should they be treated in a different way from any other property? If I have a table which I choose to jump up and down on and destroy, that's entirely my freedom to do. I'm entitled to that. It's part of the right of ownership. So if we're going to think about the idea of treating animals in a different way, there has to be a basis for it. And what we've been seeing over the last, I guess, 60 odd years, a little bit longer, but that sort of time frame, is a greater similarity between animals and humans. Many of you, I'm sure you're going to be familiar with Jane Goodall, the work she did, and there was a film came out that she made a few years ago called Jane, and she was talking about her, when she first started there, and she was saying that when she went there, the sort of perceptions and understanding of the animals was they basically fought and had sex, and that was about it. And the societies were not really regarded or contemplated or understood. what science has done in the last 60-odd years, 60, 70 years, is, if you like, rethink or be willing to revisit the idea of animals not being so different from humans. In other words, that many of the attributes and activities of humans, certainly in terms of cultural, social, relationships, sentiment, intention, planning, memory, all of these things, communication, use of tools, that we've, in the past, it's often been suggestion that, well, animals don't use tools, animals don't have communication, animals don't have these sort of relationships. And what we've been learning the last few years, and it's now recognised in the courts as well, is that this is simply not true. And in fact, one of the things we're going to look at, if I can make it work, is the idea of animals and justice. There's now people working on the idea of animals in being viewed as, in a sense, of a citizen, being able to participate in their own social structures. We're learning much more about social relationships between animals and the way that animals work with each other. Whereas up until, as I say, the sort of 6, 7 years ago, it was much more that they weren't really we weren't really looking for those sorts of relationships. And so the idea that animals are similar to humans in having a wide set of capacities, as I say, pain, consciousness, skills, and so on. Interestingly enough, I'll just make this point here and we'll come back to it later in the course. Interestingly enough, what we tend to still be doing, ironically, is looking in animals for human characteristics. So we tend to be favouring the characteristics of animals that are like humans, human characteristics, rather than characteristics that are completely different. Now, I was thinking as I came over today, the idea of one of the things we're going to do is a short film of a memory test where the animal did much, much better than the humans they were competing with. And I thought, well, yes, that sort of works, because the idea of, well, memory is a human thing, animals have memory, therefore they have human-like characteristics. But what about the idea of, some animals, dogs, for example, with a heightened sense of smell, some creatures in the sea, sharks and so on, with ability to taste in water, far, far in excess of ours, ability to see different parts of the light spectrum. We don't really know what to do with these things, and I think we're still in an intermediate stage. We're still regarding animals. We've moved to regarding animals as not really doing this, to a stage where we now regard animals as sort of being variants of humans, a sort of slightly diminished or slightly better version, but still, if you like, a sort of human avatar. If it were scientifically accepted that animals were much the same as humans, then from a legal point of view, irrespective of any other approach, the legal concept of treating like situations alike would make the present systems simply indefensible. If we were unable to make that significant differentiation, then the argument for animal rights would become, I think, much, much, much stronger, because it would be impossible to say, well, you don't have to, because. This was a court a few years ago. Cecilia, chimpanzee. And this was the judge here. Experts agree unanimously about the genetic proximity of chimpanzees. We know that. They add that they have the capacity to reason, intelligent, conscious of themselves. Some of you may have come across the so-called dot test, where they put a dot on an animal's head and then see if it recognizes itself in the mirror. Have cultural diversity, so the idea of different groups. Expressions of mental games, manifest grief, use and construct tools. Again, there's plenty of evidence all these. Have abstractive capacity and skills to handle symbols in communication. All of these are terribly sophisticated behaviours. A conscience to express emotions such as happiness and frustration. plan and organise intraspecific battles and ambushes. Moral, psychological and physical status, have their own culture. The idea of animals having their own culture. Culture we think of as an intrinsically human notion. The idea of an animal culture. Feelings of affection. They're capable of lying. I love it. I love the idea that animals are capable of lying. There's been various examples of animals deceiving others to try and put them off, and symbols for human language. So this was a court. This was a court saying these things. And then more recently in the US, asking about Tommy and Kiko. Does an intelligent, non-human animal who thinks and plans and appreciates life as human beings do have the right to the protection of the law against arbitrary cruelties and enforced detentions visited on him or her? I leave you to go and see what the court decided. So I'm just very briefly, and hopefully, going to be able to show you a few short examples from different aspects of animal communication, awareness, and so on. These are just some of the main ones. So there will now be a short pause where I hope I can make this work. This is an intelligence test. Not for me, maybe for me too.
Primate Research Institute, the PRI, where a UMU is based, have devised intelligence tests for chimps. One test is for what's called working memory, the brain's ability to temporarily store and use information. The numbers 1 to 9 are randomly scattered across a touchscreen. The chimp looks at them for as long as is needed to memorise the layout. Then, as soon as 1 is touched, the other numbers are hidden and must now be remembered. We volunteered Chris, the director of this programme, to demonstrate this test. He's a college graduate and a crossword addict, but how good is his working memory? When Chris reckons he has memorised the layout, he touches 1. When the others are hidden, he must try to recall 2 to 9 in ascending order.
It takes me ages to remember where they're all placed, and then once I've got it, it's really very, very difficult.
In 30 attempts, Chris only once reached 9 without making a mistake.
As soon as they're blanked over, it's like my mind's been blanked over as well.
When a UMU sat the same test, he correctly remembered the numbers almost 90% of the time.
I usually get it right almost every time, and I've got it right once.
Chris fears he's let his species down. But even when the PRI played a UMU against their best human students who were given regular practice sessions, a UMU still beat all humans. Other chimps of the PRI have also sat the exams. Among these apes, computer skills are as normal as the ability to swim from the trees. Though none of his rivals beat a UMU, a few came close, and average chimp results turned out to be higher than amongst humans. So, does that efficient working memory mean chimps are cleverer than humans?
So that was the first one I wanted you to see. The second one, and I'm going to stay with this while I've got the space. Again, the idea of a human skill, and one which we've very much attracted to, the idea of communication. A couple of things there. One, you came across this fear, if you like, or concern about anthropomorphism, the idea that, are we reading into activities, are we interpreting activities in a way that we would if it was a human doing these things. Are we applying to an animal? Certainly anthropomorphism was a concern, I think, in the past, and there was quite a strong movement to say, well, no, we don't know what the animal is thinking. All we know is what the animal is doing, and one has to separate out the two. I think probably that has diminished as a fear now, partly simply from the notion of saying, well, you know, given the context and given what the animal's doing and how they're responding, it might have a completely different mindset, but it would be a very strange thing. It would be very strange if it wasn't thinking those sort of thoughts. The other thing, of course, is the idea of, you know, the idea that Coco's intelligent because they've got communication. So the idea that the intelligence is defined by this human-like skill. I mean, I have a notion, you know, that if pigs could talk, I think it'd be extremely difficult for us to eat them. I mean, the idea of a little pig, you know, going along saying, please don't kill me, please don't kill me, I think would have an enormous impact on us. But anyway, that's the second one. And the third one is perhaps even more complex, or at least exploring even more the idea of really quite sophisticated analysis of our environment, and perhaps being unfair, animals that live in groups and so on have to be able to read the signs. They have to be able to get on. They have to be able to cooperate. So perhaps what we're seeing is not so unusual.
So the final experiment that I want to mention to you is our fairness study. And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more, because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs, birds, with chimpanzees, with Sarah Brosnan, who started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we took capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group, they know each other, we take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, the cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now if you give the bark and grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes as a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently, we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece he eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and we will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. That's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now. Gets again a cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here.
Right. So I came across a wonderful phrase, something like inequality aversion. Was the phrase I read in the article by Pearce in your reading this. Let me get back to the main screen. So what we've what we wanted to show you in those short films was the ideas of difference and similarity. Taking a very classic human pride, which is memory, and then having an animal far exceed us. Taking a very human skill of communication, and then having an animal apparently sort of take a sort of human skill and copy our communication. And then the third one, the idea of really much more sophisticated, the idea of justice, the idea of fair and unfair, because that's what was going on here. This was a reaction to an unfair treatment between, and there's been a lot of work being done looking at how animals respond to these things, fair scenarios and unfair. Now, obviously, there's a lot of issues in collecting the data and so on, but Franz de Waals, who's a well-known primatologist, has done a lot of very interesting work exploring these sort of relationships, and I think come up very well. So, the basic premise for animal rights has to be that for animal rights to have be worth even considering, has to be that we consider animals as having a capacity, a situation, a status, if you like, that means that the dividing line at the moment between humans and other animals is simply indefensible. And let's be quite clear, the dividing line is an absolutely blunt one. The rights that we give and the respect that we give to humans, quite properly, is on a far, far lower scale than we give to animals. Infinitesimally lower. As I say, the concern we probably give to humans is barely reflected in animals. And the most that we would do for animals is we try and avoid cruelty, and we try and improve the quality of their lives. But if one felt that the scientific evidence was such that the paradigm we'd created was simply false, that had no justification to it, then the idea of animal rights becomes certainly worthy of consideration. But it would be a fundamentally new paradigm, it would be a fundamentally new way of seeing the world, seeing how, if you like, sentient species are respected, recognised, and how they live. How we view animals, how we treat them would be fundamentally different. I mean, we'll be going into this in more detail, but right not to be killed. It's a right that as humans we take absolutely for granted. And yet for an animal, we can do it, well, I mean, bluntly, we can do it for lunch, we can do it for sport, we can do it for pleasure, we can do it just because you want to. And yet, the smallest of those would be a horror if we did them for humans. Why did you kill that person? Well, I was hungry. The person would never see the light of day, with or without the Chianti. So, right of life, right not to be used, sport, experiments, the right to be heard in court, the right for someone to represent an animal in court, as an individual, just as humans expected. In the case of Happy and Carvan, actions were brought for habeas corpus, bring out the body. The question is, does habeas corpus apply to animals? So the right to be heard, the right. Some of you may remember the monkey selfie case, Naruto, a few years ago, where the claim was brought by Peter that the intellectual property in the photograph belonged to the animal. It might include the right not to be property. We're not really sure about this. Some people think that animals should not be property. There's an argument that intrinsically having animals as property contradicts the sort of underlying concepts of animal rights. And there's some people on the reading list you can have a look at. Others believe that we can either coexist with property or that there's perhaps a different form of property that could happen. I mentioned habeas corpus and I mentioned Naruto. So it would have an effect. It's going to affect farming, animal farming. It would probably end it. Whether you could have farming for wool where the animal was well looked after, I don't know. That's something still to be explored. Animals in zoos, possible that the living conditions would have to be there, and the justification for locking an animal up would have to be there. And of course, animal testing would be very difficult. We don't test things, novel and unknown drugs and treatments on humans. Even when the conversation comes around, even the sort of worst criminal, we won't do it. And yet, and if the paradigm changed, it'd be very much harder. And of course, animals in the wild, again, the idea of sufficient space and so on. So, this course. So I say, Raphael and I designed this course 5 years ago. Raphael had been running a lecture seminar series here called Talking Animals, Law and Philosophy, which is still running. Been running now 6 years, 7, 6, and is going this year. So there's a program of events starting this term, which you're welcome to attend. We wrote this about 5 years ago, and the idea, the assumption behind it was that animal rights are a realistic, possible direction. In other words, the premise is this is not this is not promoting animal rights as such. This is saying, from a legal point of view, is it a realistic possibility? In other words, is there a serious legal law reform discussion that can be had? And the analogy I make is, I think we're probably, I don't know, where people were in the 1960s, perhaps, talking about the environment. We're at that sort of stage, the idea that people, aren't necessarily very happy with the idea of exploration, but there's a legal job to be done. So the purpose of the course is to consider what they might look like, what they might be, and we don't really know. We've got some ideas. I said to you a moment ago, property. Should there be property or not? Is it? I mean, you may have heard the phrase abolitionists in animal rights. The abolitionists obviously taking its name from the early anti-slavery and anti-slave trade movements. Part of the drawing on those ideas is, how can you possibly have animals as property? How can it possibly exist? But we don't really know. We don't know how far rights should go, and what we're going to be doing is looking at that. So we're going to, next week, we're going to, if you like, go back a little bit, but really it's more preparing the foundations. So we're going to go back into early animal welfare laws, where they were coming from, why people passed them, what they meant, and that'll give you a good sense of the sort of thinking that led to the basic animal welfare laws. And then we're going to look at the current laws, not only in the UK, but also in the EU, the US, Switzerland and other countries. And we're also going to be looking at current cases where there's been a claim made that animals do have rights. I'm going to be looking at the jurisprudence. Is this possible? Does this fit? How do rights for animals, how will animal rights for animals work? What is the nature of legal personhood and so on for animals? Going to be looking at the legal context itself. What is there out there? There are a few international or draft treaties, a few declarations and so on, and there's also been some national legislation. In fact, Raphael has been involved in the work going on in Switzerland to introduce some rights for So we're going to be looking at the drafting side. What's that drafting going to be? Are we going to use general phrases? There's a lot of merit in general phrases. Are we going to be very specific about rights? So we'll be looking at those things. And again, this doesn't really exist. We're going to be exploring it and making suggestions, and you're going to be coming up with ideas too. Because this is law in the making. This is not a set of laws which are being tweaked. And part of that thinking is going to be, what rights? Which animals? If you've been involved in discussions about these things, the cockroach effect, or the rat effect. Why does a rat have rights then? I mean, there's rats in my house, can I get rid of them? What do I have to do? Do they have the same rights as me? And then, of course, you always get the one about, you can't give animals rights. I mean, what are you going to give them, like right of free speech, right to vote? I heard someone the other day say, you can't give animals the right to vote. I think you probably can, actually, but I'll probably run with him for a bit. And then how are you going to do it? Is it big bang time? Do you just go, there we go? Or is it lots of small stages? Is it from a tactical, legal point of view, better to do small moves? And of course, the relationship with human rights. One of our colleagues is coming along to talk about human rights and animal rights, the relation between them, and the effect that one might have on the other. Has been some people express concern that animal rights would in some way diminish human rights. Now, will they diminish it, or will they be adding to them? One of our colleagues at another university is talking about the idea of sentient rights. So we start talking about human rights now, and what about sentient rights? In other words, what matters is that you're sentient, and it is that sentience, that ability to think and feel, that entitles you to rights. Public acceptability, of course. How will this work? We talked about this idea of a new paradigm. How will this fit? Again, so you can think about other areas of significant law reform where we've brought about changes that were simply impossible to imagine. One of the great things about paradigms, of course, is that before they change, we think it impossible that they could change. After they've changed, we think it impossible that people could ever have thought that way. So there's it's a sort of fundamental conceptual barrier that you can't imagine it not changing, and then you can't imagine people ever having thought that. So how would that work? And then, of course, the public acceptability of economic impact, because the financial side of animal farming is enormous. So yes, to summarise, you're going to examine current laws, you're going to explore how they can be developed, what they might look like, and how they might become law. This is the foundation. This is the start of the journey for animal rights. But what we're doing, what you're going to be doing, is starting to define it as lawyers. This isn't saying, yes, I like them or I don't like them. This is saying, how would it work in law? What is realistic? What is practical? How might law change? Because I strongly believe that law reform, as I say here, is not an abstract exercise. It's a practical process of reviewing whether the laws need to change. That's what law reform should be. It's saying, well, we had this law, is it still the right one to have? Has societies changed? Have our values changed? And law reform has to be a constant process and should always be looking in and saying, why are we doing this? Why do we do this way? And as I say, it can produce small changes and sometimes large changes. You can redefine marriage. And this is a photograph of the first same-sex marriage celebrated in Ireland a couple of years ago. Thank you very much. How do I turn it off?